Hey, kid, would you let me work here? Those words left me speechless. In front of me was an elderly man in a wheelchair, clearly advanced in age. The idea that he wanted to work seemed like a joke. No, I mean, you really shouldn't push yourself. Sensing my hesitation, the old man smiled softly and shook his head. It's fine. I'll work for just 50 cents a day. I've got something I want to do here. This mysterious old man appeared before me right after I had lost both my mother and grandmother. Little did I know that this man would turn my life upside down. And his true identity was, my name is Jake, and I'm 27. I had lived with my mother and grandmother for as long as I could remember. Even though it was a single-parent household, my mother and grandmother were always bright and full of smiles. Jake, look at this. Oh yeah, it's ripening nicely. Want to pick this tomato, Jake? Yeah. I'll do it. I naturally started helping with farming, which became both our livelihood and the center of our lives. We weren't rich, but the vegetables and fruits we grew in our small field provided us with a fulfilling life. Mom, today's tomatoes are super sweet. Right? This year's harvest seems especially good. I'm glad. Sorry for always making you help, Jake. But Grandma and I will take care of the field, so you should enjoy being a kid, playing and studying. Those simple conversations were my happiness. After graduating high school, I left home and became an office worker. Are you sure about skipping college? My mom and grandma repeatedly asked if I was really okay with not going to college when I told them I wanted to work after graduation. It's not that I hated studying, but I didn't feel a strong urge to keep doing it either. More than anything, I just wanted to make life easier for the two of them as quickly as possible. Farming is tough work. You're always dealing with nature, and the physical labor is often grueling. I wanted to start earning money as soon as possible. I'm home. Grandma, Mom. My job was a bit far, so I had to move out. Honestly, living alone for the first time was lonely. And as I faced the challenges of working, there were many days when I felt like I might break down. But knowing that my two favorite people were always waiting for me to come home kept me going. On weekends, I'd return home, and we'd share meals made from the vegetables they'd grown. Those moments brought me peace. What? What did you just say? But one day, when I was 26, fate suddenly took away the two most important people in my life. The police informed me that my mother and grandmother had died in a car accident, and I couldn't process the reality. Why did this happen? I remember standing frozen after receiving that call from the police. Time passed in a blur with funerals and paperwork. Thank you so much. I bowed my head and saw off the people who had come to the funeral. Then I returned to my childhood home for the first time in a while. I couldn't just wallow in grief. I needed to start cleaning up the house. I'm home. The familiar, cheerful voices welcoming me back were no longer there. I deeply regretted not having done more for them while they were alive. I should have shown more gratitude to my mom and grandma. Now, my childhood home no longer carried the warmth it once did, but instead confronted me with the cold, harsh reality. I should have realized sooner. But now, it's too late. When I walked into the living room, the walls were crowded with pictures of me. There was my beaming smile as a child, the slightly surprised look on my face when I first learned to ride a bike, and photos from my elementary, middle, and high school entrance and graduation ceremonies. Each one was a testament to how much my mother and grandmother cherished me. As the memories of being loved came flooding back, my heart warmed. They loved me so much. Tears welled up and streamed down my face uncontrollably. The loss of both of them felt unreal, and the regret of not being able to repay their kindness weighed heavily on my heart. If only I had expressed my gratitude more, so much more. I should have kept showing it, whether through words or gifts. I stood frozen, unable to stop the tears. After crying for what felt like forever in the living room, I noticed the room my mom and grandma used as an office. There are so many papers. I had always known it as their workroom, and I never really went inside. But when I entered, I found the desk piled high with documents. Contracts related to farm work and bills I had never seen before were scattered around. What were they dealing with all this time? I started going through the papers, but I couldn't even tell which ones were important or necessary. Still, I kept reading and trying to figure out the contracts. Thinking about what my mother and grandmother must have felt as they continued farming, always with a smile, while working in this room. It makes my chest ache. Ouch, my shoulders are stiff. After hours of sorting through the papers, a thick file caught my eye. Inside were detailed records of transactions, income, and expenses. What I found was shocking. I had no idea the farm was in such bad shape. The income was meager, while the expenses were overwhelming. On top of that, there were unpaid taxes. And it wasn't just one or two. Why did they keep this struggle hidden from me? While I was living my carefree life, what must they have been feeling as they worked? The thought of their burden made my chest tighten. Even though things were so tough, they kept working hard for me. I had no idea how much effort they had put in. I didn't know what they had gone through to keep this farm going. As I stood there, faced with this harsh reality, I began to think about what I should do. After much reflection, I made my decision. I would quit my job and return home. I resolved to start farming from scratch, to protect the land my mother and grandmother had cherished. If I couldn't repay them in life, at least I can protect this land. But the reality was harsh. I only knew bits and pieces about farming, things my mom and grandma had casually taught me, and I didn't really understand the details. Still, I thought I could manage somehow. But standing in the field, I realized I had no idea where to start. Well, I guess I'll just have to try. I grabbed the shovel and stabbed it into the ground. And just like that, the handle snapped off. Great! Is there a spare somewhere? I headed to the shed where the farming tools were stored, intending to take some out. I looked around the dusty space. Once I took a good look inside, I saw that most of the tools were falling apart. Many of them were unusable, likely due to lack of proper maintenance. I'll have to take care of these too. With so much to do everywhere, I felt overwhelmed and exhausted, eventually crouching down on the spot. I let out a sigh, but even then, I didn't want to give up. I started watching farming videos on YouTube and reading books. Gradually, I began to build up my knowledge of farming. But, of course, knowledge alone wasn't enough. I lacked the physical strength, skills, and experience, everything, really. Why is this so difficult? I worked tirelessly every day, but there was hardly any harvest, and the farm continued to run in the red. Then, one day, something happened. In the crisp morning air, I was walking towards the field as usual. My body, still unaccustomed to farm work, was a bit tired, but I had no choice but to keep going. But that morning, I saw something different. There was someone sitting at the edge of the field. Who is that? Do I know anyone around here who uses a wheelchair? The person sitting there was an elderly man in a wheelchair. I racked my brain, trying to recall if any of the neighbors fit the description, but I couldn't think of anyone. As I slowly approached, I decided to speak to him. Feeling a bit nervous, I carefully walked up to the old man and greeted him. Good morning. can I help you with something?" After a moment, the old man slowly turned to me and gave a gentle smile. "Good morning. It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" "Yes, it is." "Good morning." I felt a little flustered by his greeting. Who is this man? Why is he here? A brief silence followed as I wondered. "Hey, kid, would you let me work here?" Those words left me stunned and speechless. In front of me was an elderly man in a wheelchair, clearly advanced in age. The idea that he wanted to work seemed absurd. No, I mean, you really shouldn't push yourself." Sensing my hesitation, the old man smiled softly and shook his head. "It's fine. I'll work for just 50 cents a day. I've got something I want to do here." His words only added to my confusion. 50 cents a day sounded like a joke, and I had no idea what he meant by having something he wanted to do here. I couldn't understand why he was interested in this field. The soil was becoming quite poor. But why this remote farm? The old man looked at me for a moment before smiling again. "Kid, this field still holds a lot of potential. I can see it. So, will you let me help?" His serious gaze made me hesitate for a moment. It was true that the field was in rough shape, and I couldn't handle it on my own. But I didn't want to let him overexert himself. "But, please, don't push yourself. Farming takes a lot of physical strength, and there are risks too." The old man raised his hand to stop me mid-sentence. "Don't worry. You're struggling too, aren't you? Let me help with what I can. Besides, I've got a bit of knowledge and experience." His words made me stop and think deeply for a moment. Then, I happened to notice his hands. Though a bit worn, they were large and strong hands that had worked hard. They reminded me of my grandmother's and mother's hands. At that moment, I felt a natural sense of wanting to accept his help. May I ask your name?" The old man paused, seeming to think for a bit. "Just call me Doc," he said with a playful grin. I couldn't help but laugh a little. "Doc?" "Yes. My name isn't important." His response surprised me, but there was something about his mysterious air that made me not want to question it further. In the end, I agreed. "Understood. In that case, I'll pay you $4,000 a month. 50 cents a day isn't going to work. So, please, help me." I said that and gave Doc a big smile. And so, our partnership began, Doc and I working together side by side. From that day forward, Doc started taking care of the tools daily, and one by one, the unusable equipment was restored. His skill was remarkable, so much so that, while I stood by in amazement, he even managed to repair the broken tractor. "Wow! How do you know so much?" When I asked in awe, Doc smiled and said, "It's the wisdom of age. Plus, when you've farmed as long as I have, this much is second nature." His humble attitude made me even more grateful for his presence. The thought crossed my mind that Doc might be someone special. But since he never brought it up, I felt it would be rude to pry, so I kept my curiosity to myself. One day, while working silently, Doc began mixing manure and fertilizer. "What are you making?" "Compost. If we spread this over the field, the soil will come back to life. The earth is a living thing too. Give it the nutrients it needs, and the crops will flourish." Following his advice, I spread the compost over the field. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle changes in the field. The soil became softer, and the crops looked healthier and more vibrant. The effects of Doc's care were visible, it felt like magic. I can't believe we're seeing results this quickly. Take care of the soil and it will repay you. Now, just keep up with the maintenance. As the days went by, I started learning the essence of farming from Doc's words and actions. The field improved day by day, and little by little, we began to see progress. Then, 2 weeks after Doc had arrived, a phone call came into the office that would change everything. The call was from Robert, a renowned chef who ran a famous restaurant in Tokyo. Robert frequently appeared on cooking shows and was one of the most celebrated chefs of the time. I'm sorry for the sudden call. Recently, I bought some tomatoes from your farm at a roadside market, and I was amazed by the taste. It brought back memories of the flavors I knew as a child. Hearing his words made my heart race with excitement. Really? Thank you so much. Robert went on to say that he wanted to use our tomatoes in his restaurant. It was an order larger than anything I had ever imagined. Thank you. I can't believe our tomatoes are being praised like this. I'll get them ready right away and deliver them to you. After hanging up the phone, I rushed to tell Doc the news. Listen, Doc. We just got a call from a famous restaurant in Tokyo. They want to use our tomatoes. Doc listened, then smiled gently and nodded. That's great. Your hard work is paying off. No way. I haven't done anything. This is all thanks to you. Doc seemed a little embarrassed by my words. I felt a deep sense of gratitude and respect for Doc as his words sank in. In that moment, I realized that both this farm and my life were being saved because of him. Since supplying the tomatoes to Robert's restaurant, the phone at the office hadn't stopped ringing. Orders were pouring in not just from the local area but from outside the prefecture as well. Not only the tomatoes, but the summer vegetables Doc had worked on were gaining a reputation. Wow, another order just came in. The tomato orders just won't stop. I was loading up boxes of freshly harvested vegetables from the field, overwhelmed but thrilled by the demand. It was exhausting to keep up with the constant calls, but deep down, I couldn't have been happier. I wished my mother and grandmother could see the farm as it was now. If only Doc had come while they were still alive. But there's no point in thinking about what ifs. I murmured quietly, shaking off the sentimental thoughts and returning to my work. Just then, I felt someone's gaze and looked up to see Doc smiling at me with a reassuring expression. Doc, what's up? When I asked, Doc simply shook his head and smiled. Oh, nothing. Just thinking how hard you're working. Hard-working guys like you will be popular, you know. He let out a hearty laugh, and in that moment, I felt a strange tug at my chest. It was a familiar expression. Where have I seen that before? But I couldn't quite place it, leaving a vague sense of unease lingering in the back of my mind. The feeling only lasted a moment. Never mind, I can't figure it out. And no way. I'm not popular, don't tease me like that. I puffed out my cheeks a little, and Doc laughed even more. That afternoon, while I was doing paperwork in the office, Samuel, a fellow farmer, stopped by to check in. Samuel is the person who lives closest to me. He's been my neighbor for as long as I can remember. Hey, Jake. Your vegetables are making quite a name for themselves, aren't they? I came by to see what all the fuss is about. How did this happen so suddenly? Samuel looked puzzled, so I proudly explained. Actually, I got some major help. Honestly, it's all thanks to him. Help? Yeah, his name is Doc. At the mention of Doc, Samuel looked confused. Want to take a look at the farm? When Samuel eagerly agreed, we headed outside together. As we walked, we spotted Doc working in the distance. When we got close enough for Samuel to see his face, he suddenly stopped in his tracks. "Ha! What's wrong?" Samuel didn't respond, his eyes fixed on document. Why is he here?" Samuel shouted in surprise and rushed over to Doc. "Hey! Is that really you, Kenneth? You're Kenneth, aren't you?" I was stunned by Samuel's words. "Kenneth?" I had suspected Doc wasn't his real name, but I never imagined Samuel would know him. But more than that, the words "you're back" stuck in my mind. Wait, what's going on? "Samuel, you know Doc? Know him?" "Of course I do." "Wait, Kenneth, you didn't tell Jake?" As both Samuel and I voiced our questions, Doc let out a small sigh. "Samuel, I didn't expect to be found like this." Doc smiled wryly and fell silent, seemingly deep in thought. Finally, he began to speak. "I suppose it's time I tell you the truth. If you don't mind, could we sit down and talk inside?" As I waited for his words, my heart raced. I had avoided asking about Doc's true identity all this time, but in this moment, everything was about to be revealed. We moved to the living room, and together with Samuel, we listened to Kenneth's story. I sat there, tense, straining to hear every word this man in front of me was about to say. "To be honest, this might come as a shock, but I'm your grandfather, Jake." The moment I heard those words, I was so stunned I couldn't speak. The grandfather I never knew existed was right in front of me. I'd grown up without any knowledge of him, and I had always assumed I didn't have a grandfather. I was too overwhelmed to say anything, and seeing that, he continued. "I studied agriculture in college a long time ago and started farming on this land myself. Grandfather had been a renowned agricultural researcher, but he also loved working with his hands, connecting with the soil. He met my grandmother, and together they lived a life of farming. I met your grandmother here, and we got married. Those were truly happy days. Every day was fulfilling. We spent all our time working the fields together from morning till night." As he spoke, he smiled fondly at the memories. "That's right, Jake. The two of them were really inseparable." "They were famous for it around here," Samuel added. "I see." Grandfather seemed a little embarrassed by Samuel's comment. But as he moved on to the next part of his story, his expression darkened. "One day, I got a call from the university, asking if I'd return to continue my research. I was torn, because I loved research. But before I could make up my mind, your grandmother told me to go. At the time, your mother, Mary, was still young. But I chose to go back to the university." I listened quietly. Mary was my mother's name. To think he went back to university when my mother was still so young. My grandmother must have had an incredibly hard time. And yet, I had no idea my grandfather had taken such a path in life. But why didn't you stay with them?" "It was a university far enough away that I had to take a plane. At first, I made time to come back, but eventually, I got so absorbed in my research that I started drifting away from my family." Regret was clear in my grandfather's voice as he spoke those words. Looking back, it was true that he had been able to fully pursue the research he loved, and that must have been fulfilling for him. But my grandmother, left to handle everything alone, must have had an incredibly hard time. Housework, raising a child, and farming. Even for a man, farming by himself would have been tough enough. I deeply regret it. I should have come home more often, paid more attention to my family. It was my mother, he said, who was most upset with him for staying away. As she grew older and realized the situation at home, she sided firmly with my grandmother. I could imagine how painful it must have been for her, never having her father around for birthdays, school events, or anything important. Mom was so heartbroken. When she was in middle school, she had enough and lashed out at him. My grandfather recalled how she'd yelled at him over the phone. Even though this all happened before I was born, I was shocked to hear about it. In the end, I failed to take care of my family. We lived apart for many years, though we never officially divorced. I see. I didn't know any of that. But what about the wheelchair? Grandfather quietly began to explain. I've only been in a wheelchair for the past 2 years. When I was fully immersed in my research at the university, I was overworked, staying late into the night with experiments and studies. My body couldn't keep up, and one day, I collapsed from exhaustion. Unfortunately, I was at the top of a flight of stairs. Grandfather had pushed himself to the limit and collapsed. Since it happened at the top of the stairs, he fell all the way down. That's when he injured his spine. Despite undergoing surgery, he lost the use of his legs and was confined to a wheelchair. I debated whether to tell them about it. Suddenly calling after all those years to say I was now in a wheelchair. I agonized over it. But no answer came. After all the years I'd stayed silent, I feared they might ask, "So what?" In the end, I never reached out to them. A look of anguish appeared on my grandfather's face. Even now, it seemed he was still searching for the right answer, wondering what he could have done differently. After the accident, I thought about so many things. Should I go back home and do what farming I could? Or should I return to the university, which was willing to accommodate me in a wheelchair? I was torn. But in the end, I felt like I hadn't finished my research, and I needed just a little more time. So, I wrote a letter to the two of them. I never got a reply, though. His voice was filled with frustration and regret. He had wanted to come home, yet he chose to keep pursuing his dream. And before he knew it, time had slipped away. Caught between wanting to repair his family relationships and his passion for research, he had been stuck in limbo. And then, I completed my research. I was satisfied with the results. I finally worked up the courage to return home. But just as I made that decision, I got the news that your mother and grandmother had passed away. My grandfather's voice trembled. And so did his hands. Years of putting off coming home had resulted in the loss of his beloved wife and daughter. I couldn't even begin to imagine the depth of that pain. I wanted to rush back immediately. But my body, weakened by illness, wouldn't cooperate. More than that, I was overwhelmed by a sense of helplessness. I hadn't been there for them, hadn't done anything for them. How could I possibly face this house again? Did I even have the right to return? That feeling, he said, had kept him from moving. As he whispered those words, my grandfather looked so small. Then, I heard from others that you had taken over the farm. I heard that you were protecting the fields on your own. That was the only thing that gave me any comfort. So, I decided to return, even if it was too late. I thought that if there was anything I could still do, I'd do it. Even if you couldn't forgive me, Jake. Hearing his words, I was overcome with emotion. The fact that my grandfather, now in a wheelchair and having kept his distance from the family for so long, had returned like this. It was a sign that he was facing his past and trying to make amends. Samuel nodded quietly in understanding. So that's what it was, Kenneth. You've been carrying that regret all this time. Grandfather lowered his gaze slightly and continued. It wasn't until I lost the people I cherished most that I realized what I'd done. But by then, I didn't have the courage to come back. You were the only one left. My grandson. I couldn't abandon you. But I couldn't bear to call myself your grandfather, so I became Doc. Hearing my grandfather's feelings, my heart felt full. For a while, I sat in silence, listening to his words, unsure of where to begin. There were so many emotions swirling inside me, too many to easily put into words. But as I looked at my grandfather sitting there in front of me, I felt the need to speak the feelings in my heart, just as he had done for me. Thank you for coming back. The words flowed out naturally. I had thought I would be on my own forever. With my grandmother and mother gone, I'd felt like I had no family left. My estranged father had passed away as well. But now, sitting here in front of me, was my grandfather. That fact alone was a source of immense relief. I'm really happy. Because now I know I'm not alone anymore. With Grandma and Mom gone, I thought I had no one left to call family. I could see tears welling up in my grandfather's eyes. After taking a deep breath, I began to speak to him. As I listened to my grandfather's story, a memory from my childhood resurfaced. I wanted to share that memory with him. I remembered something. When I was little, I asked Grandma about you. At my words, my grandfather looked at me in surprise. I could see a hint of worry in his eyes. He was probably anxious about what my grandmother had told me about him. I remember asking Grandma once, all my friends have grandpas, but I don't. Why don't I have a grandpa? I've never forgotten how she answered. I followed the memory as I shared it with my grandfather. She smiled gently and said, Jake's grandpa is studying hard to make sure the vegetables grow delicious for everyone. I saw deep emotion on my grandfather's face. I still remember the look on her face when she said it. Looking back now, she seemed so proud and happy. I felt proud too, knowing my grandpa was doing something so special. For a moment, my grandfather didn't say anything. My grandfather listened quietly, seemingly absorbing every word I said. Then, gradually, large tears began to fall from his eyes. Seeing this, my heart filled to the brim. How had I forgotten this memory for so long? I wondered if, had I spoken of my grandfather more often, it might have softened things between my mother, grandmother, and him. Thank you. She truly was an incredible woman. I've come this far because of her support. Even now, I'm so deeply grateful. His words warmed my heart. Perhaps to others, and even to my mother, our family seemed unconventional. And I owe your mother an apology. His voice carried a deep sense of regret. Hearing about how he had once left his family behind to immerse himself in research now felt like a distant past. It's okay. Mom could be pretty stubborn. I think, deep down, she wanted to see you again. That's what I believe. With my grandfather here now, I had no desire to blame him. Grandpa, thank you so much for coming back. Let's keep working together on this farm. I still have a lot to learn, but I'm happy to have you here with me. You know, I always wanted a grandpa. I was jealous of the kids who had one. My grandfather nodded quietly at my words. He then rolled his wheelchair closer to me and gently took my hand. His hand was, as always, knobby and strong. Tanned from the sun, with small scars from years of hard work. I squeezed his hand firmly in return. It was warm, and it filled me with a deep sense of reassurance. I'm so grateful that you've been taking care of this farm and this home. Now, we'll be able to bring new life to this land together. That's the greatest joy I could ask for. Do you think they'll forgive me? Your mother and grandmother? Hearing that, I couldn't hold back my tears any longer. Though the sadness of losing my grandmother and mother would never disappear, reconnecting with my grandfather had brought a new sense of hope. Of course. They'll say, "Welcome home. They've been waiting for you, Grandpa." As I confidently reassured him, he wiped away his tears. Samuel, meanwhile, had been crying so hard that I couldn't tell when he had started. That's wonderful. Truly wonderful. If there's anything I can do, just say the word. If you need more hands, I'll rally the others. Really? Thank you so much. Thank you, Samuel. I'll be counting on you. No matter what challenges might come our way, I knew we could overcome them together. With that belief, I firmly decided to move forward with my grandfather by my side. Thank you. Let's keep working hard together, Grandpa. I squeezed his hand even tighter. And so, my grandfather and I worked as a team, finally getting the farm back on track. We began receiving orders for our vegetables from all over the country, and before long, we had paid off all the debt that had once burdened us. Both financially and emotionally, we had found stability. Hey, Jake. Come over here. What is it, Grandpa? Every day, my grandfather watched over the fields with care, while I followed closely behind, taking on the work. After we discovered our family bond, there was a brief period where we weren't sure how to act around each other. But now, that awkwardness was long gone. After all, we were the only family we had left. Even though we had been apart for so long, we had restored the bond between us. In the quiet joy of each day, we lived our lives with gratitude. I'm here to help. Since then, Samuel had started coming over to lend a hand whenever he had free time. To be honest, with all the orders pouring in, we didn't have enough people to handle the harvest. Not only did Samuel come, but he also introduced others to help out. The farm, which had once been run by me alone, was now bustling with people coming and going. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Together, we worked hard, sweating as we harvested the vegetables. Farming was tough and physically demanding, but I loved the feeling of working up a sweat. Look, Grandpa. It's another beautiful day. The sky is so clear. You're right. It really is a beautiful day. We all stood for a moment, gazing at the bright blue sky. The air was fresh, and the breeze felt nice. With each day filled with small, simple joys, we walked through the fields, laughing together. This became our new everyday life.